Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Dutiful Future. My name is Hugh Smiley, and joining me today is the fantastic Iain Dale, radio presenter, TV pundit, columnist, and author of a brand new book as of August 6th. Why can't we all just get along? Shout less, listen more. Some advice I probably should have taken for this intro. Iain, hello.
Hello, hi, nice to be here.
I'm very glad to have you. You're here to talk about, your career with LBC and your radio show, as well as, of course, your brand new book, which I have to acknowledge is amazing in the background there. If I haven't managed to plug the name well enough, Brett, there's plenty of time you can see for the visual listeners.
It's not even subliminal marketing, is it really?
It couldn't get more effective. For those who are somehow uninitiated and are somehow missing out on this amazing show, could you please, a brief introduction to what the show is, what you sort of do, and what you cover?
Well, I've been on LBC now for actually exactly 11 years, almost to the day. Oh, wow. And I do the evening show. I started off on the evening show back in 2010, and I then did five years on Drive. And the thing on radio stations is if you present the breakfast show or the drive time show, those are the two biggest shows traditionally. But they have to have a certain format. You can't really do hour-long interviews on a breakfast or a drive time show. They have to be pacey and really news-driven. Whereas my show, it is news-driven, but there's much more variety. Most shows on LBC are 3-hour phone-ins. I do a phone-in, but it's generally only 1 hour, sometimes 2. So we start off at 7 with a news hour because a lot of people are still commuting home. Well, obviously not at the moment, but in normal times they are. And so sort of the drive time is kind of extended, I think, now probably till about 8. So we allow people to catch up on the news of the day, do lots of interviews, features, reports. And then at 8 o'clock, we do something different each day. So we'll have a phone in generally at 8 o'clock on whatever the big issue of the day is. And then at 9 o'clock, I might do, on a Monday night, we often do a panel on a particular subject. We'll take calls as well. I might interview on a Tuesday. I might interview somebody for an hour, sometimes with calls, sometimes with not, usually quite a big name. On Wednesday at 8 o'clock, we have Cross Question. It's like our version of Any Questions or Question Time. We have 4 political people or media people, and calls come in from listeners. Then we often do a mental health hour. So there's a lot of variety on my show, and I quite like that because I have the attention span of a flea. So I like to sort of do different things rather than have it a rigid format every day.
So in your long, amazing, and obviously very varied career at LBC, what would you say if you had to, or at least one of, or if not many, your favorite moments on the show, whether it be a specific guest or a call-in, or just a moment which really sort of stands out at your time at LBC?
It's really difficult to pick one because how do you compare interviewing a prime minister with having a call from somebody who tells you that they've been raped at a family wedding by a family member? I mean, you can't really say that's a favourite moment, but it certainly is one that will stick in my mind. Somebody phoning in who's driving around the M25 who tells me he's going to kill himself that evening. Well, I have got no training on how to talk someone out of that, but you kind of, I suppose, learn as you go along and learn not to say the wrong thing. So I think a lot of the moments that I will, when I eventually finish, will remember won't be necessarily the big name guests that I've had on. It will be either phone calls from people or it'll be covering breaking news. And I really get a kick out of that because, again, I'm not a trained journalist. I'm not a trained broadcaster. But when something big happens in the world and you're live on air as it happens, that's when you earn your money. That's when you find out whether you can really do it or not. And 3 years into my career at LBC, the killing of Lee Rigby happened in Woolwich. It was just before my programme went on air. And that was the first time I'd had to do a really big live terror story, I think. And now that is really unprofessional of me, isn't it? Not to put my phone on silent.
It's totally fine. I will include it to embarrass you. I'm not going to edit it out. However,
well, feel free.
That's fine. That's fine.
And that was, I remember thinking at the end of that, it was a 4-hour program. I remember thinking at the end of it, I can do this because I've always had a large slice of imposter syndrome because I don't have any formal training. I've always thought that I could do this. But you are put in all sorts of different situations. I remember another occasion, it wasn't long after that actually, I think, an airliner went down over Ukraine, and all we knew that it was a Malaysian Airlines plane, and that it had crashed. And that again is when you find out what you're made of, because you go into rolling news mode, but that's all the information you have. And yet you've got to keep people listening. You can't just be repetitive all the time and just keep repeating what's happened. You've got to find a way of making it relevant and interesting. And you have experts on to talk to, but you can't speculate too much, because, I mean, I was convinced right from the off that the Russians had shot it down. But you've got to be quite careful how you put that. It's like if there's a terror attack on the streets of London, which again I've covered, invariably they are Islamist terror attackers, but on occasion they're not. So you've got to be really careful about what you say and what you infer from the details that you've got. But I must admit, and it sounds awful to say you get a kick out of being on air when there's a terror attack, because you, in a sense, you feel as if you ought to hate it all. But you know that you are performing a public service. You know that people are tuning into you because they know on LBC we will be covering it. Tune into 5 Live, and they might have gone to Wimbledon or something and but don't come out of it. So I know that our audience shoots up at those moments because they know that we will be on it. And it is very exciting. I'm not going to deny it.
So on the sort of, the news side of it, is there almost like improvisational, you're thrown on air and then something happens, you're stuck with dealing it. How do you balance between, obviously, I imagine that you're having quite a well-researched and well-prepped show where you come in with all these plans, and then suddenly every now and again there is just a curveball?
This is going to sound awful. I don't like doing a lot of prep because I find that it stifles me. Now, everyone is different. I did the media show on Radio 4 with Amal Rajan once, and it was all about the art of political interviewing. And I was on with Andrew Marr and Rachel Sylvester from The Times. And his first question was, well, how do you prepare for an interview with a prime minister? And I almost didn't tell the truth, because it's quite difficult to say to somebody, well, actually, I don't do any preparation. Because they think, well, you lazy git.
I'm just like this. What can I say?
I know what works for me, and I know that if I do a lot of preparation, and I've got all my producers, well, I say all my producers, I've got 2 producers on the show. If they produce a 10-page research brief, which then includes a whole list of questions, I'm a human being, so I probably go from question to question. What I want to do in an interview is not do that. I don't want to just have it so stilted. I want a conversation, because I think, particularly in the long form interviews, you get much more out of somebody. So I might have 5 bullet points in front of me. If I'm interviewing Boris Johnson, I might have 5 bullet points in front of me of areas that I want to cover, just in case I forget one of them. Because that's awful. If you do an interview and you then realise that you haven't asked about the main thing that's in the news, you shouldn't really be doing the job. Whereas Andrew Marr, what he does, and this works for him, and so I don't say it's wrong for him to do it that way, he war games an interview. So he'll have one of his producers pretending to be Boris Johnson. So he'll ask the question, the producer puts himself in the mind of Boris Johnson, imagine that, and tries to answer how he thinks Boris Johnson would. So then Andrew then thinks, okay, well, if he answers like that, I'll ask this. Now, I just can't do that, because I wouldn't be listening to what Boris Johnson was saying. I'd be thinking, oh my God, what have I got to ask next? So it doesn't work for me. And I think that if you do it in a conversational way, people accuse you of being a soft interviewer because you're not being gratuitously rude. You're not shouting at them. You're not insulting them. But you have to think of them as human beings, because believe it or not, politicians are human beings just like the rest of us. And if you go into an interview, which often happens, particularly with short form interviews, that you as the journalist are under pressure from your editor to get a newsline. So you go in all guns blazing with the first question, Minister, you have been terrible on this. You've made mistake after mistake after mistake. Why don't you resign? Well, put yourself in the mind of the minister. The minister then thinks, oh, I'm under attack. The shutters go up. So all the minister then does is revert to the 2 sound bites that his spin doctor had given him before he comes into the studio. And so the person that misses out there or loses out is the listener. because you've got the journalist asking a damn fool question just to design to get a gotcha headline, and you've got the politician who's not going to say anything at all. I don't like that kind of broadcasting. I don't want to listen to it. I don't want to do it. And if ever I came under pressure to do that, that's the day I go. And that's why I love doing hour-long interview. And this is where podcasts are fantastic. I mean, if you were interviewing me on a radio station, we would have probably maximum 10 minutes to talk.
There would have been 4 ads by now, a crappy song by someone no one cares about.
Yeah. And here we could literally go on all afternoon if we wanted. I did a podcast with Matt Ford the other day, his political party podcast, which normally they last around an hour. But we both knew that we were creating good output. And so we went on for 90 minutes. We didn't actually even have to think about it. We just did. And I think that's the beauty of podcasts. I do a podcast called Iain Dale All Talk, and I just interview one person, and it is generally for about an hour. But I did Andrea Leadsom the other day, so to speak, 78 minutes. And I've had so many people contact me after that interview saying, I've seen her in a completely different light. Now, that wasn't because I was just bowling her softball questions. I mean, it wasn't meant to be an interrogation. It was meant to be about her career, her personal life. And she relaxed into it. And she therefore revealed things which she hadn't done in other interviews. And I think that is what people want. They actually, if they're going to spend an hour listening to something, they want to know that they're going to get something a little bit different.
See, I find it interesting. You almost, you're concerned to describe yourself, or you feel like people would see you as almost like a softball interviewer.
Well, they do.
Because when I did my research, I almost saw the exact opposite. And like when I talk to people about yourself, it is, almost described as like interrogative. And like when you search yourself on YouTube, it's all clips of, Iain Dale ties X up in knots, or Iain Dale,
Yeah, well, you see, that's where, I mean, I understand that the viral clip is really important. I mean, LBC in a way has reached out to a whole new generation of listeners because of the viral clip. I mean, James O'Brien during Brexit, much as I disagree with him on it, he became a bit of a star doing that, because LBC would put out clip after clip from his morning monologues or his interviews where he would, as you say, tie somebody up in knots. And that brought in the sort of 15 to 24 age group in a way that maybe we hadn't done before. So I get why all of the digital people, they put these sort of rather lurid headlines on. Sometimes it doesn't actually tie up with the content, I have to say. And I don't really like this sort of Daily Mailization of it, but I completely understand that it has to happen. What I really rail against is, and this has happened on a couple of occasions, where you saying, when you start your subject at 5 o'clock, can you do a bit of a rant because we want to put it on the website? Well, no, I can't actually. Well, I could, but I don't. I mean, if I feel strongly about something, I'm going to have a go, but I'm not going to do it to order. I just think you just get to the lowest common denominator if you do that. If all you're thinking about is going viral on Facebook or Twitter or whatever. And when we saw an example of that the other day, when someone on another radio station cut up a face mask in front of the camera, and I thought, what are you doing? And I kind of I knew exactly what he was doing, and I just thought, no, that is not where we should be.
So and on the topic of the radio station, of course, I think a lot of the time when people are talking about politics, covering politics, there's a lot of accusations against media of political bias. How much pressure do you feel there is to sort of be a both sides type person? Have there ever been times where you've been, I guess, like confronted by bias, whether it was with yourself or people around you, when trying to engage in politics in a way which is people are so ready to accuse anyone of being one-sided or biased? Well,
I'd say it from both sides of the fence. I do not work for the BBC. I don't have to be unbiased. People know what my political background is, and although my views have probably evolved on some issues over the years, I would still self-describe as centre-right. On some social issues, I'm probably centre-left. I'm not sure left and right helps really nowadays. And sometimes if I'm offering an opinion, people sort of tweet or text saying, well, this is ridiculous. Iain Dale is being totally biased. Well, I'm actually paid to offer opinions. I'm encouraged to offer opinions. If I was on the BBC, it would be the complete opposite. Now, I can happily go into BBC mode. We were talking about breaking news earlier on. Well, if there's breaking news, I don't do that. For example, in a lot of the Brexit debates over the last few years, which of course have been meat and drink to me, people know where I come from on Brexit. But if we're in the middle of a parliamentary vote or doing something like that, I regard my role as being impartial, and I will report, I will interpret, and I will give an opinion, but it's not a campaigning opinion. I'm not trying to persuade people to support one side or the other. But if I'm doing just a normal phone in, and I'm trying to think of an example here. If I'm doing a phone in on immigration, for example, saying, should we allow more asylum seekers into the country? I will give my view at the beginning of that phone in, and I'm as wet as a lettuce on immigration. So it's my views on that are not what people expect them to be. Then I challenge my listeners to challenge me. I don't want a whole load of people ringing in to agree with me. How boring is that? There are some radio presenters who love it, who think that they're being validated if they just get people agreeing with them. And okay, it's nice for people to agree with you, but I don't think it makes for very interesting radio.
Do you ever think there's a problem in sort of, I guess once again in your sort of position where you're encouraged to have strong political views in where people aren't as open about their political biases as others are? I think, generally when I consume political media, I'm always fine with anyone having as many opinions as they like, but I tend to see that occasionally there are people who describe themselves as I guess like impartial or like objective, whatever, when really they're only banging on for one side. Or like when they're talking to a Labour person, they'll be lovely. When they talk to a Tory, they'll be awful, or vice versa.
Who are you thinking of, Hugh?
I think it's for me, I tend to love American politics, so it's like I see loads of that way. I think Dave Rubin is certainly one. He has his own radio show, YouTube channel, things like that. In the UK, I think, not to dox myself, I am more left wing. So I could give my standard answers where it's like, random individuals. But I tend to think in the UK we're pretty solid. But is there anything, do you ever see that in like sort of when you look at me, do you ever see something you think, oh, maybe really you should be a little bit more honest about how objective you can be or how objective you think someone could be?
There are one or two news presenters who I'm not going to name, but I just think I can see through you, and I'm sure plenty of other people. And these are generally the ones that make great protestations about being completely impartial. But they sometimes protest a little bit too much. But there is also, I think, subliminal bias in this as well. I think a lot of bias is not actually deliberate, but it can appear so. I used to do a lot on Newsnight when all the Brexit stuff was going on. And I remember a producer rang me up one day and said, we'd like you to come onto a panel tonight to talk about whatever the latest Brexit development was. And I said, well, who would it be on with? And they said, well, it would be with Matthew Parris, Faiza Shaheen, who was the Labour candidate who stood against Ian Duncan-Smith, and Alistair Campbell. Now, on the face of it, you could say, well, that's okay. Two right versus me and Matthew Parris on the right, Faiza and Alistair on the left. But this was about Brexit. And that was actually 3 Remainers versus 1 Brexiteer. And I said, no, I'm not going to play your game, because every time I go on a panel, it's usually 2 against 1. Well, I'm a big boy. I can cope with being outnumbered. But I said, if it's 3-1, are you going to give me 50% of the airtime? No, you're not. So, no, I won't come on unless you ditch one of the others. And they ditched Alistair Campbell, which was my finest achievement in journalism, I think.
He's
Dale, a great friend.
Booted Alistair Campbell off a show once.
He's a great friend of mine. I mean, he's somebody. I'll tell you what. If you go into the jungle, you want him with you. I have a lot of time for him, and he gets such abuse on social media, which is not deserved.
I must say that is an absolute power play. Get rid of Alistair Campbell, or I'm leaving, and for it to work. Amazing. So on to what everyone's been waiting for and what everyone has been able to see the entire time. Why can't we all just get along? Shout, let's listen more. Link in the description if anyone wants to before we start going into the topics and everything. Ian, if you'd like to just sort of go over what the book's about and why that the second this podcast is over and only when it's done, people should tab out and immediately open the link in the description and buy the book. Well,
I think that most people feel that we're all becoming a bit too shouty nowadays, particularly on Twitter. It's not just Twitter, but I think particularly Twitter. And I think if you have any sort of public profile on Twitter, you just get your head bitten off every day. And I don't make necessarily complaints about that, because I think I can be quite shouty at times, or have been quite shouty at times on Twitter. But at one point I just thought, well, I am part of the problem here. And the way I describe it is, if you send a tweet to me, I don't know you. You may not even have your real name on the Twitter feed, because I've just seen you on Jeremy Vine, and you're a twat. Thanks for that. And of course, your instinctive reaction, if you are under attack, is to go and attack further. So you instantly get onto your keyboard and you type, "You're a fucking twat." And then it escalates from there. And,
got him.
But what I've worked out is, and I had a really good example of this not that long ago, about a month, 6 weeks ago. Somebody, they didn't even at me on Twitter, they just put my name. And on TweetDeck, you can have sort of columns, and I have a column, because often cowards do that. They think, oh, I don't want him to see this, so I won't at him. Bad luck. People think I do a Google search on my own name. No, I just have this column there for that reason. And this guy had said, I can't remember what it was about, but it was something like, "Oh, Iain Dale's just a Tory stooge. He's so far up Boris Johnson's arse, you can't see him come out the other side," or something. And you think, well, someone I've never heard of, why should I even care? But I do actually care about how people perceive me, in the sense that I know that I'm not a Tory stooge. I've never been Boris Johnson's greatest fan, and I've said that time and time again. And if he does something that I disagree with, I openly criticize him. So I just sent a reply saying, instead of ranting at him, I just said, "This is factually not true." And then I gave 9 instances in the past month where I've criticised the Tories, or Boris Johnson in particular. And he came back a couple of times, left it there. And then the next day, I got a DM from him saying, "I'm really sorry. I went over the top. I shouldn't have said what I did. I've looked up more of what you've done, and I know now that I was wrong. So I've deleted the tweet." And we then started a sort of direct message conversation. And bizarrely, like 6 weeks later, he's actually become a really good friend. So Twitter has this, I say good friend that I've never actually met. Lives in Wales. But we've just, sometimes you just connect with somebody. And I had another instance where I was clearing out some papers, and I found this letter from a guy called Ray, who is an English teacher in Hamburg in 1983. We were both on gap years, and we'd met at some course. And I thought, oh, I wonder what he's doing now, because we'd lost touch. So I just put on Twitter, "Ray, Hamburg, 1983, English teacher. Anyone know him?" Within half an hour, we were DMing each other. So Twitter has a great force for good, but it also has a great force for evil. And the great thing about the internet, and it started with blogs, but it's now moved on to other forms of social media, is that it gives everyone a voice. And that is a great thing. It's democratized things. We used to live in a society where you had to be very deferential. We respected our elders and betters. It was just the natural order of things. The internet, I think, has shattered that, and in many ways for the good. But it means also that people have become less inhibited about what they say and what they do. And they do things without thinking anymore. And they don't understand sometimes the hurt and even the mental anguish that it can provoke in some people. And when I found this, if somebody has said something untoward about me, and I then go back and say something not necessarily aggressive, but quite trenchant back to them, what I've worked out happens is that a certain group of my 215,000 followers, then they swarm in on this person. And they act as sort of my Praetorian Guard. I haven't asked them to do this. I haven't encouraged them to do this, but they do it. And if you're not used to that as a sort of so-called ordinary member of the public, who considers themselves ordinary? But that can be quite a frightening experience, I suspect. So I now have to really be careful about doing that to anybody, because I wouldn't want it done to me. So, but I think it is just this constant feeling that we all have to have an opinion on something, and that if somebody disagrees with us, they must be wrong. Well, the main message of the book, actually is to recognize that just because you think something, that doesn't mean to say somebody else isn't entitled to think something else. Everyone is entitled to have a different opinion. It's perfectly valid. You may disagree with it, but if you don't engage with that debate, if you don't engage with the person who holds a different opinion, how can you possibly marshal your own arguments against them? And at the moment, I think we all tend to live within our tribes. We live in our own echo chambers. We want self-validation. We love it when other people tell us that we're right, and understandably so in many ways. But sometimes we're wrong. And I've had this on the radio where I might start off a phone in with one position, and then the power of the argument that people are putting to me means that I've either completely changed my position by the end of the hour, or it might at least have given me pause for thought. And that's all you can really hope to do in an argument. Very rarely will you ever get someone to say, oh yeah, you're right, I was completely wrong. But they might go away and think about something and think, well, were my motivations right there? Did I deploy the right arguments? So it's really just, I suppose, it's a bit motherhood and apple pie, I know, but it's really just asking people to accept that other people have a right to an opinion. It sounds so obvious when you say that, but I think we've moved away from that so far over the last few years.
So first of all, who would have known that to get you on the podcast sooner? I should have just been rather rude on Twitter, and then we could have it would have all been fine.
Yeah,
no. So first question I'd like to ask from that. So you talk about like the unacceptance of someone else's opinion. One thing that gets talked a lot, especially in like left-wing circles, when people hear an argument like, well, you need to hear everyone out, is the tolerance paradox. So the idea that the only way to have a truly tolerant society is to be intolerant of intolerance. So to not, be accepting of those who would be, extremely tolerant against it. And like, I guess specifically things like racism, sexism, homophobia, these issues. Do you think that, as a society, it would be better for us to be in the same way that we socially enforce the concept of manners? It would be better to socially enforce or socially, I guess, disincentivize having ideas such as racism and sexism in a social factor rather than having like censorship, for example. So when engaging with someone in a polite discourse about whether, I don't know, Black people should have rights, is this something that we should really be doing, or is it better to sort of be intolerant of someone else's intolerance?
Well, if you are somebody who believes that Black people shouldn't have rights, surely you've got to engage in the argument with that person, because if you don't, they just continue with that ludicrous point of view. I mean, we're using an extreme example here.
Of course.
Let's use climate change as an example, where I think it is terrible that people who are so-called climate change campaigners will not even engage in argument with those who are rather skeptical about the cause. I don't think anyone denies, if that's the right word, that climate change is happening. What some people do think is that the man-made element to it has been exaggerated. Now, there are plenty of, most scientists will say, well, that's absolute rubbish. But you're not going to convince anyone that it's rubbish if you don't actually engage in the debate. But there is often more nuance to a debate than people acknowledge. If you look at the whole debate about hate crimes, where I think we can all agree that hate crimes against gay people, against Black people, should be punished. But there is a debate developing this week about whether misogyny should be made a hate crime. Now, I can kind of see both sides of that argument, and I'm not wholly sure which one. I think if I was forced to give an opinion at the moment, I would say I don't think it should, because I do think it's rather different from homophobia or racism. But it's one where I could be persuaded on. So therefore, I'm quite looking forward to having proper debates about it on the radio, because I think these are things where normally, as a radio host, I would be expected to come down on one side of the fence or the other. But there are things where you just say to your audience, well, come on, convince me one way or the other. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. And you will have noticed that the word I probably use most often in the book is nuance, because so many things are not black and white. There is nuance out there, but people tend to dismiss it at the moment as, oh, well, you're just being weak or lily-livered because you won't come down on one side or the other. Or you have to look at arguments through a prism of nuance sometimes.
But let's say I'm watching a debate against I guess a climate activist and a climate, maybe not a climate denier, but like a climate skeptic, I guess, as you described. And then I scroll down to the comments, and all a lot of what you will see are people saying things like, "Oh, the climate activists, they were just rude, they were loud, they were crazy." But when we talk about being, I guess, intolerant of intolerance, like I mentioned earlier, it could be very reasonable to engage with someone like this, but not to be, I guess, polite, as it shouldn't be. I guess the argument people would make is that we should hear people out, but we shouldn't be polite to them, and we shouldn't be accepting of people who have hideous ideas, as there should be a disincentive to holding them in a public manner.
You've just used the phrase hideous ideas, which, yes, some ideas are hideous. The idea that
I mean in extreme senses.
Yeah. But all right, well, let's go back to Extinction Rebellion. When they started, I think most people thought that they were almost a breath of fresh air in the sort of wider protest movement. I think that they presented their case well. They made people think. They got the media to think about how much coverage they were giving this whole issue. But now, given some of the stunts that they've pulled and the way that they engage with people, I think they've lost a lot of public support, and therefore people don't really want to talk about the issue because they associate it with these idiots who think it's okay to stop national newspapers being printed. I mean, you've even got some of their leading activists now leaving them because of all of this. So I think that they kind of grabbed defeat from the jaws of victory in a way.
It's quite a good, I guess, call to be more civil in political discourse, I think. But earlier we were talking about the clips that get uploaded from LBC onto YouTube, and I tend to notice like a slight disconnect between what yourself and what the book advocates for and what we see published. Like I described some of the YouTube things there. I have some of the lists there. We have Iain Dale, fiercely roused Guardian writer, or Iain Dale's heated debate with a journalist. Is there a disconnect between the content that you produce is up with sort of trying to be nice and civil?
I don't, believe it or not, I don't write the headlines on these things.
but still the idea is presented in that manner,
Yeah, but there's nothing I can do about that. There is nothing wrong with heated debate. I'm trying to remember what that heated debate with the Guardian journalist was all about.
I believe it was Boris Johnson being racist.
That was it, yeah. And I don't believe Boris Johnson is racist. And I think it's a terrible thing to accuse somebody of racism if they're not. And of course, he was using one or two quotes taken completely out of context without having read the full articles or what the actual articles were meant to be about. But of course, I then defend Boris Johnson, so I'm therefore a Tory party stooge. So yeah, I mean, there are times when you get. I mean, last night on my show, we were talking about this about students and coronavirus and whether they should be sort of incarcerated for Christmas and all that sort of thing. And I talked to the National Union of Students president, Larissa Hardy, is it? And we were it was fine until she then was talking about universities who were not providing safe environments for their students to learn. So I said, well, what do you mean? I said, presumably, like if lectures aren't being done online and they're being done in lecture theatres, presumably all the students are socially distanced. So what's the problem with that? She said, oh, well, yeah, but they're breaking the rule of six. I said, no, the rule of six doesn't apply in those circumstances. That is in family homes. So it's perfectly okay to have a lecture theatre with people socially distanced, just as it would be a normal theatre. And she was basically saying that there were universities that weren't actually imposing all of the proper safety rules. So I said, well, tell us who they are then, because they need to be exposed if that's the case. And she said she wouldn't. And I said, no, the reason you wouldn't is because there aren't any. And it got quite heated. Now, I felt that, I mean, she might have thought that I interrupted her too much, that I talked over her because she was on, I mean, and I'm conscious of this, when the guest is on a phone line and you've got the studio microphone, you will always drown out the guest. And it did get quite heated, but it wasn't aggressive and bullying. If it got to that point, yes, there would be a point, your point would be correct. I think I don't want to see a day when Prime Minister's questions becomes like in the German Bundestag, where it's incredibly boring. No one would watch it. There's nothing wrong with a robust debate. It's just when it goes over that line, and we all might have different lines. We all might draw a different line in the sand as to what constitutes aggression or bullying or not. And I mean, normally I'm as I say, I like conversations. I don't want sort of battles,
Hmm.
but sometimes it's called for it. It's just when you do it, if you're a shock jock, and I'm not a shock jock, if you're a shock jock, you just play up to this narrative of just being aggressive on everything and
Hmm.
having a controversial view on everything just for the sake of it. Well, I genuinely don't do that. I've never manufactured a view just to either get clickbait on the internet or to generate calls. I
Hmm.
just don't do it.
But do you think there is a disconnect between what you yourself advocate for very effectively, but then what wider media tends to portray? Because I think we all know that, like, as you call it, shock jockeying, or I would describe it like, blood sports in politics, is what gets attention. These fiery titles, of course, whilst they're not your I guess they weren't your idea or responsibility. They do encourage this sort of engagement in politics to be aggressive. People enjoy seeing
Yeah.
aggressive bouts. Is this something that you think is a problem in wider media, which goes against what you're
Well,
hoping for?
it's also, yes, but it's counterproductive. If you get a reputation as an interviewer for just skewering people all the
Mm-hmm.
time, you aren't going to get any guests.
That's a good
I
point.
mean, James O'Brien's biggest interviews that got huge coverage, one with Ian Duncan Smith and one with Nigel Farage, um, got I mean, millions of clicks.
Mm-hmm.
Um, do any government ministers ever be interviewed by James O'Brien anymore? Now, he will say, well, that's their fault. I would say that if you question someone's integrity in a really aggressive way in an interview, don't be surprised if they don't want to be interviewed by you anymore. There is, and people will hate me saying this, but there is a certain game that has to be played. And that doesn't mean that you give anyone a free ride. I have given plenty of Tory politicians a real aggressive going over, but only if they've given me an excuse to.
Mm-hmm.
I don't go into an interview, whether it doesn't matter whether they're Tory, Labour, or whatever. I don't go into an interview intending to beat somebody up. But if they give me an excuse, if they don't know their brief, if they say something which I know is factually wrong, then I will mix it the same as anybody else would. But most politicians will be adult about it. And I mean, I had one, I've told this story many times, so apologies if you've heard it before. Rob Halfon, Tory MP, lovely guy. Even Labour people would say he's one of the nicest MPs in the Commons. I gave him a right going over once for, I can't remember what the subject was, but he didn't know what he was talking about. And then later in that evening, he rang me and I saw his name come up on my phone. I thought, oh God, here we go. So I answered it and he said, I just want to thank you. I said, really? And he said, yeah, because you taught me never to go into an interview without knowing the subject properly. Now, that was the reaction of an adult. The
Mm.
reaction of a child is when Priti Patel is put up by the Tories to speak on the day that Jeremy Corbyn was elected leader of the Labour Party. And she comes on the show and she says, he's a danger to your family. He's a danger to our national security. He's a danger to the economy, blah, blah, blah.
Mm-hmm.
So I let her go on and get it off her chest. I said, well, aren't you going to congratulate him? It's not my job to congratulate him because he's a danger to your family,
Mm-hmm.
blah, 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 blah. And I said, no, but it'd be quite polite if you did, wouldn't it? And it took 4 years for her to come back on my show after that. Now, I think that I was entirely justified to ask why she wasn't congratulating, just on a human level, somebody who had reached the summit of his
Mm-hmm.
political party totally unexpectedly. I just think as a human being, you just sort of say, well, I mean, it's a great achievement for Jeremy. I wish him all the luck in the world. He could be our prime minister one day, but here are the reasons why I think he wouldn't be very good in power. That is what she should have said, but she didn't.
Mm-hmm. So this appeal to civility politics, I guess, as you describe, um, it, I think I see. Obviously, it's very popular. And it's a very strong argument, also a very good book. But like a lot of times, I see arguments where people would say, "Well, civility politics sort of I guess, an obstruction to anti-status quo arguments." I think I would tend to apply it to, for example, like Bernie Sanders in America, where simply because his views were quite, out of the pale, out the open window slightly in American politics, he was considered rude and impolite. And for example, in the interview with Priti Patel, when you encourage her to congratulate Jeremy Corbyn, I personally would, she goes in saying he's horrible, he's going to, ruin your families, things like that. I wouldn't be that personally bothered if she said, oh, well done, Jeremy Corbyn. Now let me explain why he's going to murder everyone's families. I would feel like it would be an obstruction to actually going into, okay, why do you think this? Rather than I guess a performative politeness. Do you ever think that there is a sort of obstruction between by Civility box and actually getting into real, I guess, topics which can often be impolite?
Not really. I just think most of us have a just sense of decency, that we know what is right and what is wrong. And politicians can be their own worst enemies when they're asked one question and then answer a completely different one. I had that the other day with somebody, and I said, well, all very interesting. That's not what I asked you. And it really frustrated. That is the thing. I don't think that most people listening to a political interview or watching one object to a bit of sort of robustness on the part of either the politician or the interviewer. But what they do object to is when the interviewer just is gratuitously rude, and when the politician just doesn't answer the question. I remember the first time I went on Question Time, and I was really nervous about it because it's a tremendous opportunity to make a complete dick of yourself. And Piers Morgan texted me because he'd seen on Twitter that it was my first time. He said, my one bit of advice is whatever the question is, address it in the first sentence of your answer. Because even if you go off and onto a tangent, a sort of Ronnie Corbett style monologue afterwards, at least the audience knows that you've made some vague attempt to answer the question, because the politicians won't. And he reckoned that every single time he'd been on that programme, and virtually every politician would almost forget. They'd know the subject of the question, but it's a bit like taking an A-level exam. I mean, my history A-level, I just wrote everything I knew about the subject, didn't really care what the question was. And I think politicians tend to do that on that kind of program. They will, particularly if it's a subject that is outside their area of expertise, they want to convince people that they know what they're talking about. So it all sort of splurges out rather than an attempt to answer the question.
So moving on now from the professional to the personal, the book has a surprising amount of, I guess, personal details and personal stories within it. One of them that I found particularly interesting was, obviously you yourself were the first openly gay person to stand to be a Conservative MP.
Not true.
Not true. Was that not true? Am I wrong?
Well, you're half right.
How am I half right?
I was the first Tory candidate to be selected, having told the selection committee that I was gay.
Oh, okay.
I mean, there were plenty of gay Conservatives who have stood and then announced that they were gay after they got elected. So again, that word nuance.
Nuance, exactly. But at the time you said that I said in the book, you said, I have no doubt that I would now be an MP if it were not for me being gay. Is this something that you think that the UK has managed to move past? Have attitudes changed? And and if not, or if so, how do we think it can?
Again, that's a slight exaggeration. I have no doubt that it was a hindrance to me because I was the first. If you're the first to do anything, you get a certain degree of notoriety. So you had even left of centre newspapers like The Observer describing me as the openly gay Conservative candidate. And given that I was standing in quite a Conservative with a small c seat in North Norfolk, that didn't exactly do me any favours. Now, there would have been, look, there are homophobes out there. Even in metropolitan areas, there are homophobes. So I always knew that there would be a small minority of people who just wouldn't vote for me because of that. But it became a bit of a thing in a sense, and the local newspaper covered it as well. I mean, to be fair, they didn't do it in a sort of lurid way at all. But I remember about 2 weeks after I was selected, I was at the Tory Party conference. This was in October 2003. And somebody of your age came up to me and they just said, "Are you Iain Dale?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Thank you." I said, "What for?" And he said, "Because you've made it easier for everyone else." I got a bit tearful at the time because I thought, well, I hadn't really thought of that before he said it. But I genuinely think that, I mean, it wasn't just me, it was people like Alan Duncan and one or two others at the time who I think genuinely did make it easier. And if you look at the makeup of the House of Commons at the moment, particularly on the Tory benches, you could actually make an argument, and I always get into trouble when I say this, but you could make an argument that gay people are overrepresented in Parliament now, which, I mean, think about that. I mean, that would have just been unthinkable. There are now, I think, over 60 out gay politicians. Now, I've never really been sure as to what the percentage of the general population is that is gay. I always used to think it was 10%, but a lot of people think it's 5%. Well, we'll never know. So I think when you look at that and you look at the progress that has been made, I mean, if I was, I was 40 when I first stood for Parliament. If I was 40 now and stood, it would not be an issue at all. But it still was in those days. So although I would love to have been an MP, I don't sort of sit here thinking, oh God, what if, could I have got into the cabinet? Could I even have been prime minister? The answer's no. Because I wanted to do, when I was your age, I wanted to either be an MP or a radio presenter. Well, I've got one of the two. I had to go at the other one. At least I had a go. And I'm really happy. I had politics. It's a bit like coronavirus. It's very difficult to get rid of. And I still have the political virus. And in 2017, my home MP, Alan Hazelhurst in Saffron Walden, he announced he was standing down. And I went through 24 hours of agony because I was doing really well on the radio, sort of on television a lot of the time, earning quite a lot of money. And I thought, should I really give up all of this to go and do something where people will hate me? I've always thought, I said to my partner, I said, if I'd been an MP, I think we would have split up, because it is so hard on wives and partners and husbands so in the end, I wrote down a list of pros and cons and came up with 4 pros and 15 cons. That was my decision made.
Perfect.
And I genuinely don't regret it, because I love my life at the moment, and nothing lasts forever. Radio presenting is not something that is a very secure position. I mean, you've got Nick Ferrari, I think he's been on LBC 15 years, James O'Brien 13, me 10, or 10 or 11, depending on how you calculate it. I mean, we are the 3 bed blockers in the schedule. And you think, well, at some point they will want to bring in new blood. So I never take it for granted that my contract will be renewed. And because I know at some point it won't be. I mean, it may be that I decide to stop, but I can't think of another job that I would enjoy more than this.
Amazing. Well, LBC, if you ever want some new blood, Dutiful Future, no. Anyway.
Yeah, we need many more white men.
Oh, of course. I mean, diversity is key. I have my own mic. I've got a receding hairline. I think I fit the bill quite well. No.
Doesn't really count for anything.
In a better world, it would. In a better world, it would. Anyway, Iain, thank you so much for coming on.
Well, thank you for having me.
Has been amazing. Once again, the link in the description for Why Can't We All Just Get Along, Shout Less, Listen More. That is in the description. I encourage everyone to check it out and give it a read, or listen to the audiobook as I am currently. Iain, thank you so much for coming on. I hope you've had a nice time.
Thank you, indeed.
Thank you very much.